Hi, my name is Alyssa Booth, and today I'm going to be talking about the evolution of hairstyles throughout the past decade. My thesis is that hairstyles change every decade depending on what the trends are. So first we have the beginnings to the 1950s. And starting in the 1950s, the trend was to follow the movie stars. So as you can see here, some inspiration for people were Marilyn Monroe and Audrey Hepburn, among many others such as Lucille Ball and the famous icon Rosie the Riveter. All of these women had very similar hairstyles that were very short and sassy, and a classic name that was given to this type of hairstyle was the poodle cut, because it included large tight waves that would resemble a poodle. Women also started incorporating bandanas and headbands into their hairstyles, and most women during this time period would do the short hairdo rather than something long. And this style took a lot of work to maintain, to make it look like you have naturally curly hair. Next, we have the 1960s. And while the short look was still in, women started to transition to straight hair rather than it being curly and unmanageable. Some women that were admired with this new hairstyle were Bridget Bardot, Catherine Deneuve, and Jackie Kennedy. The fashion trends also switched from Paris to London, so that inspired this new type of haircut. Along with these aspects, rock and roll disco artists, they were all able to influence women to change their hair up, especially the younger women, more like teenagers, were really inspired by them, and it was considered street fashion. So next we have the 1970s. And in the 1970s, there was a very popular hairstyle called the Farrah Fawcett, which is this girl right here. And it was called this because it was named after Farrah Fawcett, and many people would call it feathered like Farrah. Farrah Fawcett was a character in the first season of Charlie's Angels, which aired in 1976. And this hairstyle included bangs along with fluffy curls, and women all across the United States use this as inspiration. Another very popular hairstyle was called the shag, and it was similar to this Farrah hairstyle, although it was just a bit messier. It was almost like a bedhead effortless type of look, and it was supposed to look shaggy, and women rocked both of these hairstyles in the 1970s. And now we're moving on to the 80s, and in the 1980s it was all about the volume. No matter what the style was, the motto was the bigger the better, and a new trend that was established in the 1980s was crimped hair, and a lot of women wore this because it was different from curly hair and it was very versatile. A lot of hairspray and height was added, as you can see, more volume the better, and scrunchies were starting to be included into women's hair, which was new. And Madonna was a huge inspiration for women during the 1980s, and she rocked a hairstyle that was called the wrap-up, which was basically you would have crimped bangs and a teased side ponytail, and it would all be tied with a loose piece of fabric into a bow. And along with these popular hairstyles, the Con-Air hot rollers were also invented in the 1980s, which many women established their voluminous curls with these rollers, and there were a lot of hairstyles such as half up, half down. The female mullet was also a thing in the 1980s, the side ponytail or the whale spout, but all of these have one thing in common: it was extreme volume. Their motto was the bigger the better. And moving on to the 90s. In the 90s, they decided to switch up with the volume and go with flat hair instead, as pictured. You can see that volume clearly wasn't a thing in the 90s. It was flatter hair that was the trend, and many girls and women were inspired by the TV show Friends to get a haircut called the Rachel haircut, which was a character in the TV show Friends. And this was a short, straight hairstyle that framed the face. And the 90s focused a lot on accessories rather than hairstyle itself, because there were a lot of different hairstyles in the 90s, but they all included things such as scrunchies, which became even more popular in the 90s, barrettes among with flowers, and plastic headbands. And women started wearing their hair up a lot more, and obviously women were wearing their hair up in ponytails before the 90s, but high ponytails became very popular along with buns and pigtails. And braids were extremely popular in the 90s because you could wear braids one day and have crimped hair the next day, which was a trend in the 90s. So you would have the perfect crimp the day after you wore braids. So that's why braids were so popular in the 1990s. Moving on to the 2000s to present. In the early 2000s, many people looked up to Britney Spears, Nicole Scherzinger, or Beyonce, and all of these women were artists, and they all had one thing in common: they had straight, long hair. And this pin straight hair was rocked by a lot of people in the early 2000s. And then moving into the 2010s, beach waves became the new trend, as you can see in the slides. A lot of people wanted their hair to look messy almost, and wanted to have it look like they just came from the beach. Purchasing a product called sea salt water and putting it in your hair after a shower was very popular to get the perfect beach wave. And moving further into the decade, short hair started having a comeback. In the early 2000s, it was all about long hair, and then so was it in the 2010s. But now, starting 2020, short hair is making a comeback, and after all, they do say what goes around comes around. So I would expect many old trends in the upcoming years to make their way back around. So all in all, women over the last 7 decades have shown how versatile and creative hairstyles can be. This goes to show that hairstyles do change every decade depending on what the trends are. And the pictures cited in the bibliography, or yeah.